everybody's definition of agent is different, right? So your agentic definition might be different from mine. So I don't think there's anybody right or wrong. Everybody has the right to claim that they have agentic capabilities in their product, which is totally fine. But if you ask my opinion, having a chatbot that kind of rags over the data is not really agentic. In my world, I think agentic AI is basically where it's all about the context, right? What context are you able to provide to a system to get the desired outcome, which has been fundamentally very difficult to automate.
Welcome to Season 4 of The Elephant in AppSec, the podcast to explore, challenge, and boldly face the AppSec elephants in the room. I'm Alexandra, your host, AppSec enthusiast, and growth manager at Escape. Today, I'm excited to welcome Anshuman Bhartiya, an AppSec tech lead at Lyft. Before that, he worked as a security engineer at companies like 30 Madison, Intuit, and Atlassian. Anshuman is a fellow podcaster and co-host of the Boring AppSec podcast, alongside one of my previous guests, Sandesh Mysore Anand. Recently, he's been experimenting extensively with building AI agents for both offensive and defensive security, and he's documenting his findings at anshumanbhartiya.com. I'll put link in the description. In this episode, we dive into the challenges of building effective AI agents, the impact of AI on security practices, and the importance of understanding AI outputs and avoiding confirmation bias. We also touch on the ongoing debate of build versus buy solutions and explore where the future of AI and security might be headed. If you enjoy this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and follow it on your favorite podcasting app or YouTube. It's the best way to avoid missing future episodes. And with that, get ready to hear Anshuman's opinions. Dive right in. Hi, Anshuman. I'm super excited to have you on the Elephant and AppSec podcast. As a fellow podcaster yourself. Sandesh the Boring AppSec. Because it's not boring episodes. It was like the ones that I listened to. But yeah, I'm super excited to have you now on the opposite side of the table as a guest. Also, was great to meet you in person, and I think recently you've been heavy on AI agents for security topic as well. Like I saw you posted a lot about it on LinkedIn. I saw also the article that went quite viral, right, on how you build an offensive security agent, like decompiling, I think it was JavaScript assets, and looking for secrets there as well, and like building a lot of projects, cyber safari, where you kind of combined both offensive and defensive side. How actually you got interested in that? Was it just like the hype, or it was actually the topic that you've been thinking about for a while?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I know we've tried to connect a few times, and yeah, timing didn't work out, but I'm finally happy that I'm here. Coming back to your question, I think how did I get started? I think when ChatGPT dropped in 2022, right? I think so. That's when I started playing with ChatGPT, all of these sort of chat body services like Claude and stuff like that. And I realized, I was able to do a lot of things in a fraction of time as I could do before when it comes to building proof of concept exploit codes or just writing scripts, all of that stuff. So I really got interested in sort of experimenting with what else I can do. And the field of offensive and defensive security is like such that there's so many ideas floating around, right? And more often than not, it requires somebody with that software engineering experience to be able to build things that can both hack stuff and that can also defend from hackers, right? So that's how I really got started. I had a bunch of ideas from my days of hunting for vulnerabilities. There were some open source tools available out there as well, but they weren't meeting my needs as such. So yeah, I just, I started implementing my ideas. I started using ChatGPT pretty extensively to help me build these scripts and whatnot. And then slowly I found myself deeply immersed in this world of AI agents, and I started learning about the frameworks, LangChain, LangGraph. I started learning about different concepts in this space, right? Like RAGs and uh, embeddings and how to sort of write a good prompt. So prompt engineering, all of those things. So slowly and gradually, I came up with this idea of, okay, so let's actually build something that can help like find valid vulnerabilities and sort of reverse engineering JavaScript files, finding API endpoints in them, and then being able to send requests and see the responses, and then being able to figure out if it is actually vulnerable or not. This like the whole workflow, right, of finding a vulnerability from an obscure JavaScript file is just like something that is a very common activity when it comes to finding vulnerabilities in applications. And there are a few open source tools, but they only automate bits and pieces of this entire workflow. Like I don't think there's any workflow out there that can just kind of start from a JavaScript file and sort of like show you all the vulnerable endpoints. So I just felt like, it could be a good opportunity for me to learn how to build these agents and also sort of see if it actually works or not. Because most of the AI, this is like a couple of years ago, was mostly hype. Back then, there weren't any production use cases, I think, especially for security domain. So I think it was a good opportunity for me to start learning more about these tools, technologies, and that's how I really got started. I was able to build something, and that agent was able to find valid vulnerabilities, right? So that just kind of proved to me that, if I start really small with a very small use case, and if I focus on, okay, what data I need to provide in to this LLM model, because it's all about, high fidelity data in, you get good output out, right? Yeah, garbage in, garbage out. That's right. So I think I realized this pretty early on, and I think that has helped me continue to experiment in this space. Yeah, yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Uh, yeah, no, I think that's pretty on point. I think there was a paper released, I want to say a couple of weeks ago, maybe by MIT researchers, that basically kind of walks over how ChatGPT and like using some of these chatbots, AI chatbots, are making people stupider or something like that. Right? Yes, yes, yes. And I can totally see that because there have been a few instances where I didn't really understand a topic, or I didn't really understand anything about a question I was asking the AI. And I realized, the AI suffers with confirmation bias, right? So if you ask it a question in a way that, you want it to answer it, sort of encouraging that is the right answer, it's very difficult to know what is right and what is not. It's very difficult to know if whatever AI is spitting out is actually true or not, right? So, and especially for things that are pretty new to you, that you don't have a lot of experience in. So, and I think that makes sense because, as junior engineers, right, if you're operating on a code base, right, the first step would be to, just kind of start using AI to build new features and whatnot, right? But I think what I've sort of heard from others and experienced myself is that the first question that any junior engineer should really begin is by asking questions what the code base is doing, right? So if a junior engineer is supposed to use AI on a code base, I think, instead of starting to build features, I think they should invest more time in understanding what the architecture is, what is the data flow, right? Like are there any integration points where user is being input from the end user, all of that stuff. Because I think unless or until you have that holistic understanding of how an application is working, how the architecture is designed, it's very difficult to sort of ask questions in a way and have AI respond to you that will make you believe that whatever it is saying is true, right? So the way I approach it is, and this has just been my process over the past few weeks, is before I start using AI to implement anything, I will first ask it to propose a plan. And I think I've seen this recommendation from other AI experts as well, is, don't just start implementing stuff. Have the AI first provide your requirements, provide all the context you can, and then have AI go through that, analyze it, and propose a plan, which as a human you would then go over and sort of analyze if something makes sense or not, right? So that's been an iterative approach. And I think especially for people who are just trying to use AI to up level their skills or what have you, right? I think it's really important to actually read what the AI is showing and not just copy
Yep.
pasting it. I see that mistake quite a bit, and I think that's a recipe for disaster, because if you sort of end up in this vicious like circle of asking the AI and then just kind of blindly believing it and copy pasting it, yeah, it will end up in very frustrating experiences, right, where you're not getting anything completed and you're just kind of moving around in circles. I have been through this myself, so these are some of the lessons I've learned, and especially for topics that I don't really feel comfortable with.
What kind of topics you're not feeling comfortable with?
So if you just take AI concepts, right? So when I first started reading about RAGs, right, a retrieval augmented generation, this is technically an AI engineering sort of related topic, right? Like, I am a security engineer. I do have software engineering background, but I've never learned the concept of RAGs or how to use AI models. So when I first started exploring and researching about what is RAG, right, my first question to ChatGPT was, okay, I want to implement RAG on this application. I think that was a wrong question in hindsight, because I should have really started with, okay, help me explain what is RAG by showing me examples and sort of taking some real world examples, right? So yeah, I've just sort of gone through my experience learning about these concepts by failing, by trying to build something without, and only to realize I don't understand the fundamentals, and then going back to the drawing board, using AI to learn some of the basics and then going all over it again. So yeah.
Are you afraid, like sometimes if we go back to what you mentioned, confirmation bias, that in a sense, well, it's not in a sense it's more your ideas, but what if AI ideas are also wrong? So whatever you're learning, from fundamentals, it can also be wrong because that's how AI sees that and not.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good question. And again, I just want to preface that I'm no expert, I'm no AI expert. This is just my experience, right? I feel like for generic stuff, right, like things that are, that there's enough data on the internet about, I think at least I tend to trust what. So if I ask AI what is RAG, right, I think I can trust the output from AI, right? But if I say, like, look, there is an application, right, I want to introduce a RAG component to it, this is how I think it should work. And then if I start with that, right, I'm already giving an opinion of how I want RAG to work on this application, even without knowing what RAG is or if it's even possible or not, right? So I think it's a slippery slope. Asking generic questions is fine, but trying to fit certain sort of design patterns in architecture without really critiquing it or analyzing it, or you're just using different models, right? You can use OpenAI's O3 model, you can use different models. So yeah, I think the user should know when to query and how to query and what models to use when. And I think that's just the experience that you will learn the more you play with the technology, I feel.
And on your side, you build the cyber safari, kind of different agents combined together. Quite often, it's actually the combination of agents, and error handling between like them. It's probably the toughest part, like defining this architecture. Like, how have you tackled this when you were building your tool?
Yeah, sure thing. So the idea of cyber safari also came about. Look, I think I already built an offensive agent at that point, and I'm like, okay, so now I have an offensive agent. It makes sense to build a defensive agent as well, right? Because what is offense without defense, like in this traditional like cybersecurity domain, right? We keep finding stuff, but we don't really actually do something about it, right? So I started off that path, and I think this was way before A2A was a thing or multi agents was a thing. I think that space was still pretty developing. Like, I don't think that there was any sort of industry wide standard of how agents should communicate with each other. There was no protocol as such. And then I think Google came up with A2A, agent to agent protocol. And then there's so much that has happened after that, right? So, I think for me, it was more about I know the offensive agent can find vulnerabilities. Now, can the defensive agent also be built in a way that it can sort of monitor these attacks, right? And sort of learn what's happening and implement security controls on the fly, right? So, I don't think it was more about the communication between the agents, but it was more about functionality. And I basically wanted to build a framework, right, where it could be as easy as you could deploy whatever agents you want. It doesn't have to be an offensive or defensive. It could be an incident response agent, product security agent, what have you, right? So that was the idea I started with, and I soon realized, agents could. The concept of agent is also misunderstood, I feel, right? Like if you ask AI experts what is an agent versus if you ask a software engineer versus if you ask a security engineer, the concept of agent really differs from person to person. So for me, I think at the end of the day, it's about, you provide an instruction to this like software, right? And then the software should understand what the intent is. It should know if it has access to any tools to be able to perform that operation, and then it should reasonably show you what the output is, right? So for me, that is the simplest definition of an agent, right? So when I built these offensive and defensive agents for Cyber Safari, it was pretty simple because I knew what the offensive agent was doing. Now I just had to read the logs from that and then start the defensive agent, right? So I didn't have to deal honestly too much with error handling and stuff. And that is also because it was just a POC. It's not something I've deployed in production and found 0 days or end days, right? It was just an experiment. I want to, and I'm actually, I'm still exploring different ideas in this space. I'm still trying to build something that I can open source in a way that it is reliable, it is trustworthy, it actually works. And I think the best way to do that is to continue experimenting and knowing what works, what doesn't work.
And do you think like when we build the agents, it's a lot behind what it relies on is a model? And you mentioned before that you should choose the model that's the most adapted to your use case. And we talk a lot about like about in supply chain, about in the packages, in open source tools that are vulnerable. Do you think it's something that eventually in the future we are going to measure in security the models that are maybe vulnerable to attacks and have like a dedicated tool for that?
I'm sure, yes. I think every model has its pros and cons. Some of these frontier labs like Anthropic, OpenAI, Google's Gemini, right? All of these models are great. I've played and I've used all of these models pretty extensively. Um, and I think, and again, I don't know what the future looks like, but I only see these models getting better and better every day. And when reasoning models came about, right? Like so O1, O3, I think Claude Sonnet 4 also has reasoning embedded in it. I think reasoning models were when it sort of triggered something in my head where, if you could see the models reason about your request and show that reasoning traces, it kind of helps you understand, okay, are you thinking about the problem the right way? Maybe there are different angles to think about it, right? So I think when reasoning models dropped, and again, I have also heard the argument where the reasoning traces that AI shows, it's not really how they achieve those outcomes. So there's some sort of debate going on whether whatever reasoning AI models show is actually accurate or not. Again, I don't want to go there, but I feel like just kind of being able to see how an LLM model thinks and being able to try out different models to see how they change in the thinking, right? I think when I think this changed when DeepSeek dropped, right? DeepSeek was, I believe, the first LLM model that you could see the reasoning traces of how it's coming to a conclusion, and it was you could run it locally on your workstation. So there was no sort of a risk of sending your custom data to any of these providers, right? So yeah, I think that is also something I've learned which model to use when. Oftentimes, what I find is I will be using one model extensively, and then that model just fails, or the context window is so large that the model starts to hallucinate, right? At
Yeah.
that point, I just switch to a different frontier model, and I'm able to sort of unblock myself. So that's how I've sort of learned how to use different models. There are also models that are not focused on reasoning. And I think for smaller tasks, right? Like if you just want to automate a very small script, right? Why would you use a frontier model, right? So kind of these smaller use cases, right? It's very interesting to know, because cost is also something you have to be very cognizant about as you're building in this space, right? It can become really expensive, right?
Yeah.
So how to choose which model for which task and do it in a cost effective way in order to build a product that you could actually sell to consumers. I think these are very interesting domains. And I'm also seeing as some of these security vendors, right? They're figuring out, okay, how do they price these agents, or how do they charge their customers, how much the agents,
Yeah.
so it all kind of depends how much inference cost you're sort of you're paying to these LLM vendors,
Mm.
what are different integration points, which models to use. Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned vendors because, like, for a set, there are so many definitions of agentic. Like, you
Yeah, yeah.
different people that have their definition, and I'm sure a lot of security vendors have their own definition of
Yes.
agentic. How would you recommend, security engineers to evaluate the agents that security tools propose or sell to them?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and especially with RSA,
Yeah.
we saw pretty much every vendor sort of say that they are now agentic and they support agentic. Yeah, I think, and again, this goes back to my point of everybody's definition of agent is different, right? So your agentic definition might be different from mine. So I don't think there's anybody right or wrong. Everybody has the right to claim that they have agentic capabilities in their product, which is totally fine. But if you ask my opinion, having a chatbot, right, that kind of rags over the data is not really agentic. It's like you're building a chatbot, right? You're asking it questions and it's being able to fetch the answer from some kind of database using the vector
Usually,
embeddings and whatnot,
uh,
right? So yeah, so I think that's more like a chatbot. It's not. I wouldn't call it agentic. Yes, there are certain ways you can make it agentic, but off the shelf, I don't think that's agentic, right? In my world, I think agentic AI is basically where it's all about the context, right? What context are you able to provide to a system? It could be a software, right? To get the desired outcome, which has been fundamentally very difficult to automate, right?
mhm.
So think, like, again, I'm an AppSec engineer, right? So if I think about it from an AppSec engineer's perspective, right, when we look at design reviews or threat modeling, right, these are activities that are very manual intensive, and it requires somebody's skills and experience, right? Like if you ask a junior engineer to do a design review versus a senior engineer, the outcomes will kind
Well,
of
it's different.
differ based on their skills and experience, right? And this is something that has been very difficult to automate for obvious reasons, right? Like you can't just automate design reviews, right? But having said that, if you sort of sit down and think about what is a design review, what are you trying to do? Okay, you're trying to find out if the authentication is properly implemented or not, if
Mhm.
authorization is properly implemented or not, if there is anything sensitive being logged or not, right? So if you sort of think about the problem from first principles, right? Okay, what is a design review? These are the artifacts, or these are the attributes I want to extract from a document, right? And then you can go about building an architecture, right, where you give this software the right context and you explain to this software slash agent how to approach that problem, right? And you do it in a way that is consistent, based on what works, what doesn't work. You show the agent what is a good example of doing a design review versus what is a bad example, right? So I think combining all of this is what I think really starts to show that agentic capability, right? Because now you're essentially producing a system that can think like humans. They're not humans, but they're able to do things that otherwise requires cognitive ability from human beings. And you're able to do that because you're training in a way using prompt engineering, context engineering, what have you, right? Of how these agents should go and do that task, right? That to me is more of an agentic AI capabilities, right? Because now you're basically trying to automate things that weren't possible before. It's not a chatbot anymore. It's not
Yeah.
like I'm just asking questions, right? I'm actually having it execute code. I'm actually having it interact with external services, external APIs, right? Yeah,
Understanding, I think, the context by AI agent is the hardest thing because
it's the hardest part.
every application is just so different. Every organization as well is so different because the way people doing design reviews in each org, it's going to be different. And I think like design reviews is the initial part, and then you have like the then the tool potentially finds and triaging them as like another part. Would you trust, for example, AI agent on triaging vulnerabilities eventually? Because I think something we discussed, automated remediation.
Yes, yes,
Actually, automate remediation, you should also know what
yeah,
to prioritize to
yeah,
remediate.
yeah. No, I think absolutely, and I think there's a handful of security vendors now who are building in this space of automated triaging and remediation. And and again, I think this is a very complex problem, right? Like every organization deals with hundreds and thousands of CVs on a daily basis, right? How do you essentially how can you build an agent that can help you triage these CVs? So you have to really take a step back and think from it from first principles, right? Okay, what is it that you're trying to do? You're trying to figure out if a particular CV that was exposed on, let's say, your container infrastructure is bringing any risk to the organization, right? That is like the simplest explanation of how to triage a vulnerability is, right? So now in order to do this, right, there's multiple things that you have to sort of understand. First, what is risk to an organization? Every organization's definition of risk is different. What their risk appetite is different, right? So having that understanding where, okay, this is risk, we calculate risk by, multiplying likelihood and impact. And for our organization, the likelihood has this scale. For our organization, the impact has this scale, right? So just kind of being able to explain all of this to an agent itself would be the first problem, right? Because you can't expect an agent to reasonably triage anything if they don't understand what the risk is, right? So it is possible to sort of build this automated triage slash remediation system using agents, but I think the trick is to start really small. The trick is to sort of build something that will help triage CVs that have already been triaged by your team and then comparing the output. Okay, so let's say we have a spreadsheet of 100 CVs, right? Somebody on the vulnerability management team of an organization has taken that effort to triage each and every one of the CVs line by line, right? And you probably have that justification, that explanation stored somewhere, right? Now try to build an agentic system that can do the same triaging for you, right? And then compare, okay, where did the agent fail, where did the agent reason about it in the right way, right? And then how can you make the agent smarter by either bringing the right context, right? So maybe the agent wasn't able to triage a CV because it didn't have the right context, right? So I think more time should be spent on figuring out where the system is failing
Mm.
and keeping on to improve it. And I think that's like a good approach of how to build these systems at scale.
Would you then outsource it or build it in house? Because if it takes so much time, to train it on the context, when is the right time to bring it, to build AI agents in house for
Yeah.
security?
Yeah. I think that's a great question again. And I think this is the evergreen question of build versus buy, right?
Yeah.
My opinion on this is every organization's maturity is different, right? Every organization's security team's maturity is different. If there's an organization that is slightly more mature, the security engineers understand, they have good processes in place, they have the flexibility to go and build agents and sort of like fail and then learn from that. I think in those kind of organizations, at least trying to build these agents out internally would make more sense in my opinion. But there are also organizations that have one or two security people team, right? And they are just overwhelmed, right? In those kind of cases, it makes sense to go and take a look at different vendors who are trying to solve that problem, right? So yeah, I think there's no one size fits all like solution here. It kind of depends on what are the problems that you're trying to deal with, what are the resources you have, how much risk appetite, because I think going and buying any security vendor that operates in this AI native space has its own problems with respect to privacy and legal concerns, right?
Yeah.
No company wants to send all the data to a third party sort of provider. So yeah, there are so many sort of nuances that you have to consider making these decisions holistically.
But I think like more and more security engineers actually asking those questions, because we get
Yes.
more and more questions about like how do you train your AI models on what data.
Okay.
Like I had to create a whole privacy doc based
Yeah,
on that.
there you go.
And then I think it's good questions to ask for
Yes,
everyone,
yes,
because I think that's how you also understand in a sense if the solution is solid
yes.
too, and what output can you get. So for this season, I have a new question that I ask on each episode, since it's more like controversial,
Okay,
kind
I
of.
love it.
So what is your least favorite security buzzword?
Least favorite security buzzword.
What you think it's too like overrated? That's what we consider.
I think considering the topic of AI, I would say like fully autonomous, agentic solution.
Yeah.
It's not one word, but like whenever I see this on any sort of security vendor's pitch, I'm like, okay, I don't think that's fully autonomous. But yeah, I see where you're going with it. So yeah, I don't like to hear it because I still feel like we are a few years away from building anything fully autonomous.
Maybe eventually we'll build.
Eventually. Yeah, absolutely. I think 6 months from now, if we have this conversation, my answer might change, to be honest.
We'll see. Yeah. I think already like in a year and a half, there's so many things that's changed. So many things actually that didn't change, and they're going exactly the same. So I think there's definitely big discrepancy between like tech companies in San Francisco, San Diego, etc., versus kind of sometimes the rest of the world. And it's like if you go to very traditional, like let's say manufacturing organization, they're not talking about the agents.
Yeah,
That's all,
yeah, yeah.
so it's gonna.
I think that's right. I think we have our own technology sort of. So, like you said, SF, like anything in, I think it's very different because I had the same experience. Every time I go to like some of these conferences, I meet all kinds of people, and some people have no idea what AI agents are. Some people are like so forward thinking, they're kind of building this complex AI agentic infrastructure. So, yeah, it's all over the place, I feel right now.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where like the definition that you mentioned is so important. So we'll see. Thank you so much, Anshuman, for coming on the
Yeah.
show. It was a pleasure chatting with you. I think I learned a lot, and it was super interesting for me, the topic and stuff in the conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate it.